Welcome back. This is the video number 2 for the third lecture in game design theory. We left off with our discussion of systems, and now we're going to look at how that interacts with gameplay and the evolution of gameplay over time. As we look at players playing the game, picking up the game pieces and interacting with the game and with each other, we can see that a lot of the time activities are structured into looping sequences. So something like a single hand in a card game, or a single run in a dungeon crawler, or etc., etc., they are structured as a sequence of actions that have a particular structure according to the rules of the game, some kind of a resolution, and some kind of a reset, right? You go out, you hunt monsters, you get the loot, you sell it off, you recover, you buy stuff, and then you reset, and then you go back out again. You play a hand of cards. A determination happens of who wins depending on the card game. Maybe you get some chips from the pot, and then you start over. Maybe to a specific point. Maybe everybody's playing until somebody runs out of chips, or maybe until some number of points, or maybe you're playing to reach a specific point in the story in Diablo, or maybe in a game like Sims, you're enjoying just the sort of daily routines and seeing the characters develop over time and grow, more mature, more successful, older. But this kind of a repeating activity is something that is very common in games, and is a common behavior that we see when players interact with a game. By looking at an individual game system and seeing how the player interacts with it, we can get an idea of how one of these activity loops might work, right? We looked at the interaction of combat and economy in Diablo, for example. But it turns out that's not enough, because when the player is interacting with the game, what we should be looking at is interacting with different kinds of game loops at different time scales, because there's a different kind of an activity that's going to happen minute to minute. For example, going out and fighting enemies and doing tactical combat, as opposed to something that you do on a 10-minute basis, like going back to camp, restocking, and going back out. Then again, something that happens on an even lower frequency, such as upgrading your character, leveling up, learning new skills, might only happen once every half an hour, once every hour. However, it is also very important to the player and is a crucial aspect of the game. So what we need to be looking at is activity loops that are being driven by systems, but that are different from the systems themselves. So one way to look at this is to hide the mechanics themselves and just look at the looping activities in separation, with a little bit of knowledge of like what the mechanics and the systems are, but basically hiding the details and concentrating on the looping activity itself. So in a game like Diablo, for example, we might consider the actual combat and going out and attacking as the highest frequency activity, because you have to do it very frequently. Then coming back to camp and restocking and recuperating as something that happens maybe a little bit less often, maybe once every 10 minutes. Then the character upgrades and skills upgrade happens even less often. But we can draw them together as concentric circles, as activities that loop around, as it were, at different velocities, and that gives us a very quick and convenient way of communicating all these different activity loops together. So here's an example from a game like Monopoly. We can imagine the fastest activities as the smallest circle in the onion diagram. The moving around the game board, making money, losing money happens very frequently. A little bit less often we buy properties in hotels or maybe sell them. Even less often we might complete entire sets of properties, 3 in a row kind of a thing. That gives us more money. Much less often we're going to be bankrupting other players and taking large steps towards winning the game. And all of these are important, right? Because the large loops are the long-term goals in the game. Our goals are to bankrupt other players and become the monopolist. So the large activity loops give meaning to the small activity loops. However, the large activity loops also exist only through the small activity loops, because without moving on the game board and making and losing money, we would never be able to achieve the sort of long-term goals of winning the game, buying out other players, and so on. So there's interaction between these loops of different frequencies. Also, by having loops of different frequencies, we give players a variety of different goals to try to achieve at the same time, because players go through these loops concurrently. So they always keep in mind that, oh, I'm trying to bankrupt other players, and in order to do that, I should probably be completing sets. In order to do that, I should probably be buying property, selling property, making deals, and in order to do any of that, I need to be making money on the game board. So they're always achieving these different goals, and these different loops will turn around at different points in time, right? The buying properties, selling properties might cause set completion, it might not. Set completion might happen completely separately by dealing with other players, or etc., etc. So by stacking these goals, stacking these loops, we give the player a huge variety of things to look forward to and to strategize towards. Here's a couple more examples from games as different as Diablo and The Sims, but we can see very similar kind of a structure, right? The tightest loop, the most frequent loop, are the things that are going to that you're going to be doing very frequently. In a game like Diablo, it's going to be the actual combat, which then is supported by and also supports the larger loop of clearing out entire areas, completing missions, which supports and is supported by the larger loop of skill progression, level progression, and the overall story at the outside layer. Something like The Sims also has the similar structure. Sims has the additional benefit of actually being designed around a workday, so your tightest loop is also the workday, right? Like wake up in the morning, eat something, go to work, sleep. But this feeds into the larger loop and is supported by this larger loop of having a job, working during work days, socializing on the weekends, trying to keep all of your needs balanced. And the larger loop still is going through your character's life, advancing at work, building a family, building friendships, maybe at the very large outside running an entire town, or maybe running a large multi-generational family, and see how things evolve over time. These are all important, and as designers we need to keep all of them in mind at the same time. In this kind of analysis, we should also consider something called the core loop. So we talked about different kinds of loops of activities. The core loop is the level of repeating activity which the player will find interesting and meaningful. So in the Diablo example, just walking around and attacking monsters every 5 seconds or every 10 seconds by itself is maybe not necessarily interesting enough to keep the player playing, but the larger loop of getting loot, coming back to camp, restocking, and going back out, that is typically interesting, right? Like you can go through a single loop like that, reach a point where you're satisfied with it, put the game away, come back, go through the loop a little bit more, and it would be still interesting and a kind of activity that you want to come back to. Similarly, something like The Sims, maybe just a single workday is not interesting enough, but running the sort of through a little bit of the career, making a bunch of money at work, buying some furniture, expanding the house might be the kind of a loop that keeps you interested. Core loop will typically be similar across players of the game. It doesn't have to be necessarily the same. Some players will find some activities more interesting than others, but typically when we talk about a core loop, it is the looping activity that is self-contained, that is coherent together across the different activities that you do, and where you can put the game away and then come back to later on, and then keep playing a little bit more, advancing through the larger loops, but coming back to a kind of a starting point, a place of where you've completed some things and you're looking forward to starting the next ones. And once we start talking about activity loops and players coming back to the game or keeping participating in these loops, we should ask ourselves, why do they do that? And this is a question of motivation. Why do players keep playing the games? And motivation is the key towards us setting up gameplay loops and systems in such a way that they will lead to a desirable player experience. And the way we can look at it in terms of motivation is really as two kinds of motivation: intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is probably the more familiar to us because as players of games, we know that feeling of just enjoying the game and having fun with it, not because of anything that it's going to give us, but because it is doing something for us. It is speaking to us in a specific way that we find interesting. We talked about different player models, that learning how to play the game is inherently interesting. Learning how to overcome uncertainty is inherently interesting. And these are the kinds of themes that weave their way through studies of intrinsic motivation. We as humans enjoy learning, we enjoy getting better, we enjoy experimenting with the world and seeing how it works. And there are going to be a variety of different motivations, as we talked about in the first lecture, whether they are centered around mastery and figuring things out, or achievement and getting somewhere, or social elements of interacting with other players and having a good time just being in their company, and so on and so forth. We enjoy intrinsically these kinds of activities because they give us the kind of experience that we seek. And there is one interesting effect that happens when we encounter an activity that we really enjoy, which is that feeling of losing time. I think everybody who's played a game knows the feeling of looking up and suddenly it's 1 a.m. and I've been playing this game for 3 hours, and how did this happen? I've completely lost track of time. This is a very familiar feeling with games, but it's also a familiar feeling with other kinds of activities. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who was a psychologist, studied this effect in great detail as something that happens to a lot of in a lot of different contexts. Writers, athletes, musicians, everybody who's working on a problem who's working on some kind of an activity, can very easily find themselves absorbed by this activity. And his studies were trying to look at what is it exactly that causes this effect to happen. And he posits this theory of flow, that you get into the state of flow, that state of when you're losing time and you're really engaged in the activity and the world sort of falls out and you're no longer paying attention to it. He posits that we get into this flow state when we are challenged in a way that meets and ever so slightly exceeds our skills. So when we are in a good state, in the sense of doing something that we find challenging but not too challenging, that really captivates our attention. And we talk of it as a flow channel because it is a sort of a narrow band between something that's too challenging for given the skill or not challenging enough. If we're participating in an activity that's not challenging enough, we're going to be bored. If we're participating in an activity that we don't have the skills for, it's not going to be enjoyable. It's going to be more anxiety building than anything else. It is really a question of building up the balance between the player's skill and the challenge we present that really drives this kind of an effect. And more specifically, what these studies have suggested is that there are 3 or 4 very specific conditions for achieving this. One is going to be a clear set of goals, giving the player a very specific thing to strive for. And these goals might be open-ended, such as experimentation, or they can be very specific, such as winning, but they need to be clear. The Balance between challenge and skill is something we just talked about, which is the activity can't be too easy and it can't be too hard. Three, there needs to be clear and immediate feedback about how somebody is doing. And when doing something like sports, for example, the feedback is very immediate. You can see and feel how well you're doing. In something like maybe practicing music, it can be harder. When you're a novice, just practicing scales might be incredibly boring. But once you get past that and get into the more creative parts where your skill gets a little bit higher to meet the challenge, the feedback will be clear and you will see exactly how you're doing in the context. And four, there needs to be a congruence between task specific and long term goals. So the things that you're doing right now need to be understandable in the context of something that you're striving towards. If you don't have long term goals in this kind of activity, then the task specific activity is not going to make any sense, and you're not going to get into that state. However, if if the activity matches these specific conditions, then it is very conducive of getting into the flow state. And very interestingly, games are very good at meeting these conditions, right? As we said, a clear set of goals is something that games typically have a lots of. Players will know exactly what they're doing, know exactly why they're doing it. Balance between challenge and user skill is probably the hardest thing to achieve because it's really difficult to know for a game what kind of a skill the player is going to have. In multiplayer games, we may want to try to match players against other players with similar skill level using something like LO rankings in chess, etc. But it is an ongoing challenge in many games. However, clear and immediate feedback is very easy as well, and we're going to talk about that in 1 second a little bit more. And then finally, congruence between task-specific and long-term goals is something that comes out of the activity loops, which we talked about just a moment ago. If we design the game to have activity loops of short-term and long-term cycles that support each other through shared systems and shared mechanics, these loops and these short-term and long-term goals are going to be congruent. So games are almost custom-made, as it were, to get the player into this flow state, or at least they make it very easy to structure activity in such a way. Now, the topic of making progress leads us directly into the question of extrinsic motivation. So this is motivation based not on just purely enjoying the activity, but on getting some kind of a feedback or reward or something that will basically drive us towards participating in this activity. In some cases, in like Diablo, for example, as you succeed in the game, as you get through the challenges, you unlock different parts of the world. You get to experience different parts of the story. RPGs and open world games are very good at this, using the story and the narrative of the world as a reward for making progress. It's almost inseparable to talk about the feeling of going through the world and exploring it from the actual activities of progressing through the game, getting through the quests, and succeeding. However, there are games that don't have that kind of a setup, right? Especially, for example, multiplayer competitive games. They don't have a story that you're trying to progress through. Instead, what you're playing towards is winning. What you're playing towards is points and victory over other players. And in those kinds of games, the progression that you're making is also very clear because you can see your score, you can see where you are in the rankings, and so on. In those kinds of games, there are specific mechanics that we can use in order to give the player this kind of very clear feedback about how they're doing and to motivate them extrinsically in their progression through the game. And they're called progression mechanics. So easy examples would be things like experience points. As you perform actions in the game, you earn XP. As you earn XP, you level up. And each XP milestone is a different kind of a level point that you can spend on things. Speaking of which, currencies are a popular way of providing extrinsic motivation. As you play the game, you earn in-game currencies, which you can spend on rewards, you can spend them on equipment, you can spend them on unlocking different parts of the game, and so on. Progression mechanics are the kind of a carrot that we can use to guide the player in a specific direction. Ideally, this is not the only thing that the player is striving for, because just playing for extrinsic motivation is not going to be enjoyable for them. There needs to be a mix of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. However, we can use things like currencies and XP and so on to gently remind the player if their intrinsic motivation is waning. So the next question we could ask is, how should we provide these extrinsic motivations, the XP or levels or gold, etc.? There are a number of options. For example, we could give the player some XP for every second that they're playing, or they could give them a reward every time they log into the game, and so on and so forth. But as we look at games that are popular out there, we can very easily see that those games don't do that. Instead, the games will provide progression rewards for doing stuff in the game, and even so, not always consistently. And in order to understand why that works, we should look at how people and animals and basically entities with agency respond to rewards. Operant conditioning is a study of how animals and people respond to rewards over time. This was a field of study that was more popular during the first half of the 20th century. Since then, we've learned that it is not sufficient for understanding neither animals nor human beings. Especially human beings are very complex in their motivations. However, it is a very basic kind of a study that illuminates how rewards affect behavior. And just for that reason, we should take a look at this, because it can be both useful for us in creating rewards, and also it can be useful for understanding why games that exist are set up in specific ways. So what we mean by rewards is the study of how activities of the agent, whether it's an animal or a human being, when they're rewarded, how they affect the behavior in the future. For example, an experimenter might teach a pigeon how to peck in order to get food, and then modify the kind of rewards that they get for pecking, and see if that's going to cause the pigeon to peck more, peck less, whether it's going to cause them to keep performing the action even when the rewards stop, and basically see how the interaction between the reward and the action causes the action to be repeated in the future. So these are called reward schedules, in the sense that they describe how the rewards are metered out based on behavior. The typical schedules from the early psychology, the sort of like early behavior psychology studies, are as follows. Fixed interval schedule, which was what we mentioned just a moment ago, reward the agent on a regular time schedule. As long as they're doing their action, keep giving them something every 5 seconds or every some amount of time. Fixed ratio is similar, but giving them a reward based on a fixed number of actions performed. So, for example, every 5 actions. And then we can start modifying this. Variable interval. So as long as they're doing the action, reward them every variable number of seconds. Or variable ratio, which is as long as they're performing actions, give them a reward every X number of actions where X is randomized. As it turns, and there are many more types of schedules that have been analyzed, but these are sufficient for us to understand because the effects are very clear. As we increase the variability in response to agents' actions, this leads to what's called best reinforcement and lowest extinction, which means that the agent will keep working in order to get the reward, and they will work longer and longer even if the reward stops coming. Now, what's interesting is that variable ratio reward schedules is also something that is fairly common in video games. Not necessarily intentionally. It's not that necessarily anybody looked at behaviorist studies and decided we're going to reward players at a variable ratio. Rather that in the process of designing games, people have realized that giving players reward for what they're doing is good for their extrinsic motivation. And games are full of variable ratio reward schedules. If we look at dungeon crawlers, or I mean, just to continue our example, uh, but the same thing will happen for other games. We can see that uh, these games are full of random rewards as you go through the game and you play and you attack monsters and you look for treasure. You will have a chance to get a reward. You will have a chance to get loot if you put in the work. If you don't put in the work, you don't get anything. If you do put in the work, you will get a randomized reward. Could be larger, could be smaller. You never know what's going to happen. There's a little bit of comparison here with slot machines too, in a sense that the reward might happen or might not happen, but you have to do the activity in order to get something. And Similarly, also to slot machines, there could be large payouts, jackpots. There could be small payouts. There could be nothing. In a certain sense, there are multiple kinds of reward schedules layered on top of each other. Some of them are providing very steady drip of rewards. Some of them are providing very large rewards, but with a very low probability of actually getting it. What's interesting about a game like Diablo is that there are multiple types of these reward loops. Some of them are based on activities of going around attacking monsters, and some of them are based on exploration, right? Exploration is also being rewarded in this similar manner. We have to go around not just killing monsters, but also exploring the area, unlocking chests, finding hidden treasure, and it works in a very similar way. If we put in the work, chances are we're going to get different kinds of rewards. And again, there are different concurrent reward schedules happening. There's going to be a fairly high chance of getting low-end rewards, and also there's a separate kind of a schedule which has a much lower probability, but of much higher quality rewards. So we have games that have these kinds of very layered reward schedules. And again, it's not necessarily that the games are trying to manipulate player behavior, but rather game designers have noticed that if we reward the players in an irregular way, it will give them a motivation to keep coming back and trying to explore this activity space and trying to do different things in order to maybe find the rare loot that they've been looking for. So in the end, when it comes to extrinsic motivation, we needed to really find something that works for our specific game. What is the thing that's going to give the player a sense of progression? It's going to depend on the genre, depends on how this kind of motivation works with intrinsic motivation, how it works with the kinds of activities that we're trying to encourage the player to be engaging in. In some cases, it could be as simple as giving them gold or XP points. In other cases, we may want to give them items that will be changing how they play the game. So, for example, give them weapons or armor or things that will let them take on harder and harder challenges, or give them ability to do things that they weren't able to do before. In other cases, we might reward them by unlocking different parts of the world and letting them enjoy new parts of the story, or create something that they weren't able to create before. There are many ways to give the player a sense of progression, and extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivations have to work together. There is no obvious way of describing it in the sense that it's going to be very game specific. So you need to find what works for your game, but keep in mind that the player will be intrinsically motivated to play the game if it speaks to their motivations, and also the player will benefit from having extrinsic motivation layered on top of that, because it will help them see how they're doing in the game, and it will help them get the feeling of progression, of advancement, in addition to their own motivation. We could also ask, does extrinsic motivation work without intrinsic motivation? And for that, we can look at something like gamification, which is an attempt to use game mechanics and especially progression mechanics in order to get people to participate in activities which they might not otherwise want to engage in. So gamification elements would be things like reward points, levels, badges, and so on. For example, Stack Overflow gives participant badges based on their answers and how they're perceived by the community. Sites from Facebook to Twitter to Reddit and so on will either surface points or likes or other reactions from other readers that are giving users feedback about how what they're posting is received. Some places will have achievements, maybe even virtual items that you can get in exchange for participation. Things like achievements on Xbox and PlayStation are a great example of just extrinsic motivation for playing the game, no matter what the game is, right? And if the player is missing an intrinsic motivation, it produces a very interesting effect, right? Because if you're not enjoying what you're doing, it's gonna feel like a chore. And a website that gives you gold stars for performing chores doesn't make them any less of a chore. So we can sometimes motivate people a little bit by giving them extrinsic rewards that they don't care about. We can definitely motivate people by giving them extrinsic rewards that they do care about, like money. However, just giving them stars and badges, it's only going to work, it's only going to get us so far if the player or the user is not interested. In case of something like Twitter or Facebook or Stack Overflow, users are typically already interested in what they're doing, and the progression mechanics are just a sort of frosting on top that keeps them going. However, for more work-related elements, where users are not interested in the activity, just adding gamification is not going to work. It's giving somebody gold stars for performing chores doesn't make them any less of a chore. So to recap, in this lecture we looked at the middle layer of our model, the gameplay, what happens when players pick up the mechanics, the material elements of the game, the pieces and the rules of the game, and they put them into motion and they start playing. And very quickly it turns into activity loops, activities that players engage in, which change the state of the game, and the evolving state of the game changes their behavior, and the resulting feedback loops, which cause the game to go on and change over time and provide the kinds of interesting challenges and information and activities for the player. And this in turn is what creates the player experience. This is what feeds into the player's interests, it feeds into the player's motivations, and creates the experience for them hopefully the experience that we designed for them. But ultimately it is up to the players, because players have their own agency and they will take the mechanics, they will do with them what they want, and we can guide them, but we can only ultimately hope for the best. We can hope that they will have the experience that we want them to have, but the experience that they will have is entirely up to them. And so we have reached the end of lecture number 3, focusing on systems and gameplay. Thank you.